Hello, Alan. Great to see you. How are you doing?
Lovely to see you, Russell. You're doing well?
Yes, I'm all right, thanks. And congratulations on behalf of the whole of the Ecclesiastical Law Society for your new appointment. You're now the General Secretary of the Anglican Church of Canada. I wonder, to kick off the discussion, maybe you can let us know a little bit more about what that job entails.
Well, thank you, Russell. Thank you. That's very kind. The job is actually set out in our Constitution in Section 16. So I'm the assistant to the primate in the primate's role as president of the General Synod and the chief operating officer of the General Synod. I have primary responsibility for ensuring that the Synod itself meets and is organized, and for organizing our Council of General Synod, which we'll talk about in a few minutes as well. Plus, I sit ex officio on every single national committee. So I have a small staff that I manage, and the directors of all of the departments of the General Synod all report to me.
Great. Well, that sounds like it'll be keeping you busy, that role.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Absolutely. Now, we're recording this conversation at the end of 2020, and I suppose this has been a year in which no part of the church has been unaffected by COVID, and I suppose Canada's no exception to that.
Absolutely. We are in the middle of regional lockdowns right now, and it's clearly been a challenge for people. What's incredible to me is the way in which people have risen to the challenge and learned new skills and started doing online worship and so on, and online pastoral care. So there's a silver lining, but it's been very difficult, obviously. And people have died and suffered, and it's been very difficult.
Absolutely. I mean, it has for every part of the church, hasn't it? Well, we can see behind you a map of the Anglican Church of Canada, and we're going to talk a little bit, aren't we, about the structures of the church nationally and at different levels of jurisdictions. And the first thing that strikes me as I see the map behind you, Alan, is just how vast the territory of the Anglican Church of Canada actually is.
It's a sizable territory. We're the second largest country in the world, and so we cover, we carve that up into 30 dioceses, and we've got 4 internal provinces, what we call ecclesiastical provinces, similar to York and Canterbury, each with an archbishop. And it's a bit of a confusing place at some level, but geography does sort of have a number of implications for us. For example, our General Synod can only meet once every 3 years. Because travel to get to the meeting is quite substantial. You might be flying 4 or 5, 6 hours to get to the meeting. So it does have implications for how we do our work.
Sure. Now we're talking over Zoom at the moment. Have you actually found during this past year, despite all the difficulties you've mentioned, that Zoom has actually been a beneficial tool that you might continue to use in the future, maybe, just because of that reason of the distances?
I think so, yes. One of the silver linings is we have obviously a number of national committees, but we've got one called the Council of General Synod, which sort of exercises the role of General Synod in between those 3-year meetings. So normally the Council of General Synod meets for 3 or 4 days twice a year residentially near Toronto. We've not been able to do that under COVID. So instead we've had, I think, 3 one-day meetings between June and September, and then a 3-day meeting in November, which would have been our normal time for a 3-day meeting. And that's all been by Zoom. So the advantage is that we haven't had to, put people on planes and accommodate them for, 3 days to be able to have those meetings. And so it's saved us an enormous amount of money. And it's made it possible to meet more frequently, which is another interesting advantage, because it's simply prohibitively expensive for that council to meet more frequently than twice a year.
Sure.
The disadvantage, of course, is that Zoom isn't quite the same as meeting face-to-face in person. You don't get the conversations in the corridor or over coffee or what have you that help to build the community and build relationships. So it's not entirely an unalloyed good, but it's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
And we might well wind up, with some kind of a hybrid style of meeting going forward, where we meet sometimes by Zoom and sometimes in person, but we haven't come to conclusions about that. Certainly a possibility, though.
Sure, absolutely. I think everyone's addressing those questions in different ways. Well, we should talk about the jurisdiction and the synods. Before we do, you just mentioned the different levels of the church, and I suppose one distinction, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, thinking about bishops and archbishops, in England, we have 2 provinces, and the metropolitans of each province are also both primates, always, York and Canterbury. But from what you were saying, Canada has an extra episcopal level. You've got a primate, and then metropolitans, and then diocesan bishops. Is that right?
Yeah, so the primate, so we have one primate who works in the same building I do when we're both there. And she is styled the chief metropolitan.
Right.
So sort of a primus inter pares among the other metropolitans. We also have a national indigenous archbishop who is styled metropolitan, though without a provincial jurisdiction. And then we have the 4 metropolitans of the 4 ecclesiastical provinces. So 6 archbishops total, of whom currently 3 are women, and but 1 primate.
Yeah. And then diocesan bishops, obviously, in addition.
Exactly, 30 dioceses with each with a diocesan bishop. Some have suffragans as well, but not very many.
Right. So that to some degree, I imagine, lines up with the different levels of synod. So the synod that you're responsible for in your role as General Secretary, that's called the General Synod. You mentioned already. So do you want to speak a little bit about the responsibility of the General Synod?
Sure. So just a little bit of history. The General Synod was formed in 1893 in Canada, and was formed by the coming together of the ecclesiastical provinces. So the province of Canada at the time, which subsequently got split into 2, and that includes the current Canada and Ontario, and the province of Rupert's Land. And then there were 3 extra provincial dioceses in the civil province of British Columbia, which later formed a province, ecclesiastical province. And so what happened was there was a desire for a kind of a national expression of the church and a national governance of the church, but without eliminating the provincial jurisdictions. And so the provinces delegated some of their authority to the General Synod. So we're a federated church where each of those jurisdictions has a certain level of authority. Each of those 30 dioceses, 4 provinces, 1 general, each of those 35 groups has a synod, which is a legislative body, which has a body of canons and constitution and so on. So each has their sort of own level of responsibility and area of jurisdiction.
Sure, I see. So that's quite a lot of complexity. How did the different jurisdictions divide up? How is it determined? What is decided at what level?
Well, it was set up by and large. It was determined by the provinces when they came together to form the General Synod. So the General Synod has responsibility for the national expression of the church, for national ecumenical relationships, for relationships with the Anglican Communion, and sort of internally, if you will, has responsibility for the definition of the doctrines of the Anglican Church of Canada, responsibility for the Book of Common Prayer. We have our own Book of Common Prayer 1962, which is in the family of the 1662 book, but it's a revision of it. And we have responsibility for running a pension plan, and also for standards for theological education and for uniform standards for licensing of clergy. So those are the key areas of responsibility for the General Synod. There are two or three others, but those are the key ones. provinces maintain their responsibility for the regulation of the episcopate. So bishops are elected in Canada at a diocesan level, but that election is confirmed by the province.
Mm-hmm.
And the local provincial metropolitan is the chief consecrator for a bishop. Mm-hmm. Also, oaths and subscriptions of the clergy are at the provincial level, which seems a little odd, but that's the way it is. Total regulation of the episcopate would include election and resignation and retirement and discipline of bishops. Is all handled at the provincial level. Dioceses have responsibility for basically their day-to-day affairs. So for property, for parochial organization as well. So parishes, as in the Church of England, are a creature of a diocese, mm-hmm. And the diocese specifies how they will be governed. So where you would have, say, a universal system in England of the PCC, there's a roughly equivalent system in each parish in Canada, but the details of it are specified by the diocese rather than the national level.
Mm-hmm. And when you say by the diocese, is that by a diocesan synod or by the bishop?
That's correct. Diocesan synod would set up the regulation of sort of how a parish governs itself. So there's some minor differences. They're very, very similar, obviously, but there's some minor differences and some differences in nomenclature and so on.
Mm. And other levels of archdeaconry and deanery between the parish and diocese?
It depends on the diocese. So each diocese can decide whether it wants to have archdeaconries or deaneries, and most do, because frankly, it's just geographically necessary. But the specific role and responsibility of each archdeacon or each regional dean or rural dean would depend on what's specified by the diocese. So again, diocesan synod and bishop.
Yeah.
So an example would be in the Diocese of Edmonton, where I served until recently, there were a number of archdeacons who did not have archdeaconry, geographical archdeaconries, but rather they were appointed with portfolios of expertise. So there was an archdeacon for congregational development, an archdeacon for Indigenous ministry, and so on and so on. So their sort of geographical territory was the entire diocese.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. And so, of those people watching this video, those who are ecclesiastical lawyers practicing in England, their daily bread when it comes to the jurisdiction, in many cases, is the faculty jurisdiction. Of course, making changes to church buildings, exhumations from churchyards, and the like. Is there a faculty jurisdiction exercised in Canada?
Not in remotely the same way as in England. So there is some control at the diocesan level, which varies from diocese to diocese as to what parishes are allowed to do with their buildings. And so there may be some process in a given diocese of seeking consent to, make a change in a building or to undergo some kind of substantial renovation. But the details will differ from diocese to diocese, and there wouldn't be a chancellor involved normally.
Right.
So normally there'd be an archdeacon who would sign off on something, or sometimes a bishop. But in some cases, it may be that there's really very little control over buildings, and so you just kind of take care of it. You do what you need to do.
Yeah, sure.
Often control comes down to money. If you need to borrow some money to do something, usually, the diocese may have funds available to lend, and then you get into some more serious conversations about what you propose to do. Sure.
That's interesting. I mean, that's obviously a big difference between our churches. And then something that the Church of England is certainly talking a lot about at the moment is clergy discipline. After one reads, the 19th century church history onwards, a constant story of new attempts to adjudicate matters of clergy discipline, and they all seem to end up being burdensome, cumbersome, expensive, and have various drawbacks, and various drawbacks with our current system have been found at the moment, and so very much in discussion. And Ecclesiastical Law Society's working party on the matter is feeding into this discussion. The discussion is, what will replace the current clergy discipline measure. I wonder whether Canada has a clergy discipline system, whether there's anything we might learn from that over here.
Frequently when I talk about Canadian canon law, I say system is a strong word. The historian Alan Hayes has said that that governance in the Anglican Church of Canada has always been diffuse and untidy, and that's certainly the case with clergy discipline. So clergy discipline is a shared jurisdiction among the various levels, General Synod, provincial, and diocesan. The General Synod's role is to set up to define ecclesiastical offenses, and so we have a discipline canon, Canon 18 in our set of canons, which specifies what would constitute an offense, such as a violation of a canon, or being convicted of a criminal charge or something of that nature, and what the processes are for discipline, so that protecting natural justice and so on. I mean, obviously the accused has some right to being protected, as well as the complainant. But then initial jurisdiction for a disciplinary matter lies with the diocesan bishop. Mm-hmm. So if somebody's accused of heresy, for example, which I knew a diocesan chancellor really wanted to see some more heresy trials, but we never got any. So then the complaint would go to the diocesan bishop, and the diocesan bishop could make a decision. Mm-hmm. But there's a diocesan court as well, and so the bishop can refer a matter to the court directly. Alternatively, if the diocesan bishop finds the cleric guilty of the offense, then the diocesan court acts as a court of appeal. There's a provincial court, which is another level of court of appeal, and then there's the Supreme Court of the Anglican Church of Canada, which is at the General Synod level, which is the final appeal. For discipline of a bishop, the first instance would be the provincial court. So the complaint would be taken to the provincial court. To my knowledge, I think only one provincial court has ever met in our time, in our history. Right. That would be the province of Canada once. And the Supreme Court has only met once as well. And it has initial jurisdiction for a complaint against the primate or the national indigenous bishop, or we've also got a bishop for the Canadian Armed Forces. And so complaint against any of those would go to the Supreme Court. It's only met once, and that on a reference case to determine whether a bishop had been lawfully and canonically consecrated. Mm-hmm. So it's a very messy kind of system here. Again, system being a strong word. Clergy do, unfortunately, need to be disciplined from time to time, just as anywhere else. But it's quite particular to the circumstances within the diocese as to exactly how that works.
Do you find it's usually the cases tend to be drawn out, quite expensive and time consuming and that sort of thing?
Well, the courts often don't meet. Mm-hmm. And we don't tend to have the sort of expensive process that you've got with the clergy discipline measure. One of the big differences, of course, is that we're not an established church; we're a voluntary association, mm-hmm. And so that makes a huge difference in how things work. If it's a really serious matter, it's likely to go to a civil court. If somebody commits, sexual misconduct of some sort, it may well wind up in civil court rather than an ecclesiastical court. And so we just step back at that point and say, we don't get involved because we don't interfere with the civil process. And then there might be if the person's convicted of some horrendous, heinous crime, well, that's an ecclesiastical offense as well. And so, that conviction having happened, the person might then be disciplined. But that's a straightforward matter normally with the bishop.
I see. Yeah, mm-hmm. Sure. And then maybe the last area of jurisdiction it might be interesting to talk about is liturgy, because you mentioned the 1962 prayer book. In England since 1962, if I'm right, we've had Series 1, Series 2, Series 3, the ASB and Common Worship in that time. So I'm wondering, I'm sure there must be some services newer than 1962 that get used in Canada that aren't part of that prayer book. How does that all work?
Well, and there's a funny story there, actually. There was a Lambeth conference, maybe circa 1920, I could be wrong, that upheld the jurisdiction of bishops to authorize liturgy. Mm-hmm. It was around that time period. It might have been a bit earlier than that. And Canada has really taken that to heart. Mm-hmm. So we've had a number of experimental liturgies as well. Our own Series 1, Series 2, Series 3. Instead of an ASB, we have a BAS. Same words, just different order. Mm-hmm. And the Book of Alternative Services was published in 1985 by the National Church, by the General Synod, but it wasn't authorized by the General Synod. It was published with a commendation that it be used where authorized by the diocesan bishop. Mm-hmm. Which is, fascinating, and really the General Synod, in my view, does have authority to authorize liturgy. We don't have a clear canonical structure like the Church of England, and that would be really nice to have, frankly. Mm. But it has really quite carefully not used that authority for most of that time. Now, an interesting thing happened in 2019. Indeed, in 2016, we finally did authorize some liturgy at the General Synod. In 2019, there were a number of liturgical works that were authorized by the General Synod. And that's really the first time that the General Synod has authorized liturgy since about 1962. So it's a very interesting thing. But what it means is that diocesan bishops rely quite a bit on the authority of Ius Liturgicum. Mm-hmm. And General Synod has sort of stood aside and said, well, you just exercise that authority and we won't bother. Mm. But it makes it untidy. I mean, our Book of Alternative Services is de facto the most frequently used liturgical resource in the country. There are some parishes that use the Book of Common Prayer, 1962, as their primary liturgy, but most parishes use the Book of Alternative Services or some newer thing. But it's not authorized by the General Synod. Could be, probably should be, but it isn't. Mm. And so in theory, the diocesan bishop could just pull the plug on the worship of almost all the parishes in the diocese. Mm. In practice, that's not going to happen, but it's just a bit weird.
So in practice, somebody moving within a diocese or even between dioceses will generally find familiar liturgies in practice, even though in theory a different diocese could have a very different liturgy.
In practice, yes. I mean, I used to be in the Diocese of Montreal, and we used the Book of Alternative Services regularly, and the Diocese of Edmonton does as well. So every diocese does. But yes, in theory, there could be some minor variations. So, the Bishop of Edmonton has authorized the use of common worship across the diocese, and so people are free to use common worship.
Right.
So, and the next diocese over might not have done so.
Sure. Sure. Well, I mean, this has been really fascinating, Alan. We should probably wind up the conversation, but it's been so interesting to talk about your role and to just get this snapshot of Canada and these different areas of distributed jurisdiction. It's so interesting. It reminds me of the fact people say when it comes to church buildings and liturgy, the building always wins. You've got to fit the liturgy to the building, and to a degree, what you're saying makes me think that ecclesiastical law needs to be fitted to the geography, doesn't it, to make it practical and realizable?
I think that's probably true, yes, and it mirrors our civil system as well, where we have distributed jurisdiction civilly as well, because there are different circumstances geographically across the country. So you might have, Alberta's just going into lockdown on COVID, but Yukon has 2 cases. They don't need to be in lockdown. They're fine. And so there are different circumstances across the country. It does make it a bit more untidy and a bit more, well, we set up synods in Canada because the bishops were concerned that when they were giving directions to their clergy, they might be misconstrued as being arbitrary.
Mm.
And you could see how there can be a sense of arbitrariness when a different bishop gives a different direction to the next bishop over. So we have the kind of sort of middle ground, I think, between arbitrary and system at this stage.
Mm-hmm. No, well, I think that's really interesting, and I mean, I'm always interested in questions of subsidiarity and how that works out on the ground. So I've really enjoyed this conversation today, Alan, and maybe you'll come back again in the future and tell us a bit more about the Canadian canon law and Canadian structures. It would be great to talk again sometime.
Love to do it, Russell. Lovely to see you, and be well.
Likewise. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.